Imagine a researcher standing ankle-deep in the mud of a tropical rainforest. The air is thick with humidity, the buzz of insects, and the distant threatening grind of machinery. He's there to study REDD, plus there's a calf, a massive global policy designed to save these very trees. You would expect his field notes to be filled with the gritty reality of what he sees. The tension of the local villages, the smell of the soil, the complex, messy negotiations of survival. But if you look over his shoulder at the page, the forest completely vanishes. The mud and the chainsaws are gone. Instead, the notebook is filling up with a different language entirely. Words like governmentality, disciplinary technologies, and neoliberal subjectivities. He isn't looking at the trees. He is looking through a lens grinded by French philosophers in the 1970s. It is a fascinating, almost jarring transformation. The researcher isn't describing the world. He's dressing it up in a costume. What should be a moment of pure observation turns into a rigid performance, where the chaotic reality of human life is forced to recite lines from a theoretical script. It raises a strange question. At what point did we stop using theory to understand the world and start using the world just to validate our theories? So that opening image of the researcher in the mud, missing the forest for the theoretical costume, I think that's the perfect entry point for this deep dive.
It really is. It frames the entire problem so perfectly.
Yeah. Our mission today is really to explore that intense friction between theory-driven frameworks on the one hand and just raw, grounded observation on the other.
And the cost. We can't forget the cost of this theoretical performance.
Exactly. We're looking at where theory helps us see, and crucially, where it kind of forces us to look away.
It's a foundational crisis, really. And I think we need to approach it from two linked directions.
Okay.
First, we have to look at the internal methodological war that's, been raging in sociology and anthropology over how valid knowledge is even produced.
The battle over whether you start with the data or start with the theory.
Precisely. And then second, we have to look at the external fallout from that. How this theoretical performance, especially with all the academic jargon, has created this huge crisis of public trust.
It makes science feel distant and even risky to people.
Yeah, exactly.
So let's establish the key players in that internal war right away. We're focusing on two major ethnographic approaches, right? They represent these two opposing starting points. On one side, we have what's called grounded theory, or GT. And the goal there is to be, I guess, radically empirical, purely inductive.
Right. And then on the other side, you have the extended case method, the ECM, which explicitly starts with theory. It champions a theory-driven reconstructive approach.
So if grounded theory is all about theory discovery from the data,
then the extended case method is all about theory reconstruction using the data. It's a fundamental difference in how you even define your case. Is it a self-contained unit? Or is it a reflection of these huge macro forces? Your answer depends entirely on which of these philosophies you start with.
Okay, let's unpack the origins of this disagreement then, because this wasn't just, a friendly suggestion. Grounded theory came out of a pretty profound historical and political polemic back in the mid-20th century.
Oh, absolutely.
What were the founders, Barney Glaser and Anselm Strauss, what were they reacting against so forcefully?
They were reacting against what was, frankly, a suffocating intellectual environment. It was completely dominated by abstract, logico-deductive, structural functionalism.
Right.
You have to think about the sociology of that era. It was all about figures like Talcott Parsons.
Ah, the grand theorist.
The grand theorist, exactly. Parsons created these incredibly sweeping theoretical systems that covered, everything from the nuclear family to the global economy. But they were purely abstract. They were built from an armchair using a logic that basically dictated how the world must work.
So the older generation were seen as these master architects, just drawing up blueprints for society from 30,000 feet.
That's the perfect metaphor. And the complaint from Glaser and Strauss was that these senior figures had become theoretical capitalists. They generated all the intellectual currency.
Which left the younger researchers as what? The workers?
The proletariat testers, as they put it. Their job wasn't to generate new theory. It was just to take the grand theories of their mentors and go out and perform empirical tests.
Just checking boxes.
Just checking boxes. It's not engaging in the creative, inductive process of building theory yourself.
That sounds incredibly stifling. I mean, it just kills the joy of discovery. So grounded theory was fundamentally a democratizing force then, a way for researchers to escape being just data collectors for the old guard.
That was the goal. They wanted to swap that heavy-handed deductivism, where theory dictates what you see, for what they called empiricist inductivism.
So tell us more about that inductive aim. What does it actually mean in practice?
Well, the central premise of grounded theory is that the theory has to emerge directly, almost organically, from the data itself.
Huh.
The famous, and I should say often controversial instruction from Glaser was for the ethnographer to literally ignore or at least delay reading all the theoretical literature at the start of their research.
To avoid being contaminated.
Exactly. To avoid having their observations contaminated by pre-existing concepts. The goal was pure discovery. Start from zero and build up.
That sounds incredibly liberating.
Yeah.
You're giving primacy back to the messy, on-the-ground reality. You see 1,000 things, and from those 1,000 observations, a pattern of theory emerges naturally. But you note that this commitment to avoiding external structure actually led to this counterintuitive self-limitation, which has been termed the iron ceiling.
That's the trap. That is the trap of pure, unadulterated empiricism. By intentionally limiting their scope and defining their theory generation as middle range. So, focusing on observable segments of social life, not universal forces, Glaser and Strauss unintentionally built a methodological ceiling.
And this ceiling, it traps the ethnographer.
It traps the ethnographer within the micro and meso-level domains of social life. They become phenomenal reporters of what happens within a specific system, a hospital, a company, a community. But they are structurally constrained from extending that analysis upward to the macro-level forces.
Okay, let's use a concrete example to make that distinction really clear. Let's say I'm studying how the American healthcare system treats undocumented immigrants. Grounded theory would give me what?
It would yield a brilliant, highly localized theory, perhaps a theory of institutional gatekeeping, or maybe personalized resilience within that specific hospital setting.
But where does the iron ceiling prevent me from going? What can't I see?
It prevents you from connecting those local actions to the big global structural forces. So if the person is suffering financial stress, GT can tell you how they negotiate the hospital bill.
Right. The micro interaction.
Yes, but it struggles to connect that negotiation back to macro-level global capitalism or institutionalized racial inequality or specific federal immigration policies, all the giant forces that made them vulnerable in the first place.
So the analysis stays horizontal. You might compare that hospital's gatekeeping practices to, say, a school's enrollment practices, a segregative comparison.
Precisely. GT relies on segregative or horizontal comparison. You compare one case to another, the power dynamics between doctors and patients to the dynamics between teachers and students, and you note similarities and differences to build a mid-range theory, maybe about power asymmetry.
But that comparison, it reduces a deep hierarchical structure to a limited, flat comparison between two similar cases.
Exactly. It gives you minimal insight into the wider, hidden structural forces that shape both of those relations at the same time. You end up sacrificing the sociological imagination, which, requires linking personal biographies to public issues.
That makes perfect sense. Staying on the ground level is descriptive, but it can't be truly explanatory about the larger system. So this brings us to the theory-driven response, championed by Michael Burroway and others, the revival of the extended case method, or ECM.
Right.
So if GT tries to tunnel up from the micro, ECM tries to break through that ceiling by starting from the macro.
That's it. ECM's central goal is what's called vertical abstraction. Instead of starting with the data to find a new, contained theory, you start explicitly with an existing theory. Marxist, feminist, post-structuralist, whatever it may be, and you descend to the concrete case to find the missing micro-foundations. Then you ascend back to the abstract using the specifics of your case to modify and deepen that original theory. This is why the central mission of the ECM is defined as theoretical reconstruction.
Okay, let's really drill down on that word, reconstruction.
Okay, sure.
Because it's critical to emphasize this is not just a return to the old despised deductivism where researchers just try to confirm what Parsons already said.
Absolutely not. And we have to be really clear about this. Dogmatic deduction is all about seeking confirmation. I have a theory, I will find data to prove it.
Right.
Pure induction, on the other hand, seeks discovery. I have data and a theory will emerge. ECM seeks refutation and modification.
So you're actively looking for problems with the theory.
You're demanding that the ethnographer treat the case study as a crucible, a place where existing theory is put under immense pressure, forcing it to change and improve. It's an unapologetic embrace of a theoretical orientation, acknowledging that theory guides our gaze and helps us locate these localized social processes within their wider determining context.
I think we need a clearer philosophical anchor here.
Yeah.
You mentioned a connection to Imre Lakatos, who saw theories not as single ideas, but as these complex layered structures. How does that view inform the ECM?
Well, Lakatos was deeply concerned with how scientific research programs evolve without, immediately collapsing every time they encounter one contradictory fact. So he developed this concept of the research program, and it consists of two essential parts. First, you have the unfalsifiable metaphysical heart of it all, the hard core.
So if we take, for example, a core Marxist theory, what would its hard core be?
The hard core would be the fundamental conviction that history is driven by class struggle, the inevitable tension between the owners of production and the workers. That belief system is non-negotiable within that framework.
You can't disprove it with one case study. It's the lens itself, the worldview.
Exactly.
So if the hard core is immune to attack in any single study, how do you stop the theory from becoming just dogma that never changes, like the old structural functionalism?
Well, that's where the second part comes in. The flexible, testable, protective belt of auxiliary hypotheses.
So this is the part you can actually test.
This is the part you test. The protective belt contains the specific testable predictions that are derived from the core. So for our Marxist example, the protective belt might include specific predictions like the rate of profit will tend to fall over time, or workers will inevitably form unions in response to wage stagnation.
I see. So the fieldwork using the extended case method isn't aimed at the hard core at all. It's aimed specifically at those testable auxiliary hypotheses in the protective belt.
That's exactly it. When an ECM-ographer enters the field, they are specifically looking for data that refutes or forces a modification of those auxiliary hypotheses.
Right.
So if you find a case where automation actually increases local wages and strengthens worker autonomy, which contradicts the hypothesis that technology always increases exploitation, you don't throw away the hard core of class struggle.
But you're forced to reconstruct the protective belt.
You have to. You must ask. Under what specific, localized conditions does technological change not lead to immediate, simple exploitation? This ensures the progressive reconstruction of the theory. It makes it sharper, more nuanced, and capable of explaining a wider range of phenomena, rather than just confirming its own dogmatic beliefs.
So the field side is used to refine the theoretical tool. You're forcing abstraction to confront and ultimately integrate the overwhelming myth of empirics.
Yeah.
That vertical movement is the key difference from grounded theory's horizontal comparison.
Yes, that's the whole game.
We've established that the truly effective scientist, under this ECM model, is partial to analytical theory because it allows for that vertical abstraction. But this leads us back to a deeper philosophical challenge, the illusion of a theoretical research. Whether you embrace theory or not, you are never a blank slate when you go into the field.
That's the core of the reflexivity problem. Every single researcher enters the field with a theoretical predisposition, a worldview, an assumed set of relationships. The question isn't if you have a theory, it's whether you are a reflexive scientist self-consciously aware of the theoretical baggage you're carrying.
Because the moment you decide that X is data and Y is just irrelevant noise, you're applying a theory.
You are. And if the grounded theorist pretends they don't have a formal analytical theory, what often fills that conceptual vacuum?
What does?
They fall back on folk theory. Common sense, or, the theory of the people they're actually studying. And this is a crucial distinction. Folk theory, the explanatory framework used by the public or the people in the case study, versus analytical theory, which is the complex intellectual framework of social science.
Let's give a clear example of folk theory in action.
Okay. Think about the folk theory of poverty in America. A really common folk theory is the belief in pure meritocracy. People who are poor simply don't work hard enough, or poverty is just a result of bad personal choices.
That's classic common sense, often reinforced by ideology. So if an unreflexive ethnographer goes into a low-income community and starts asking questions, they might inadvertently reinforce that common sense.
Absolutely. The ethnographer might ask, tell me about your personal budgeting choices, and the subject, who is operating within that same folk theory, might reply, well, I shouldn't have bought that one thing. That was a mistake. The researcher, looking for a micro-level theory, might then conclude that financial stress is caused by individual poor choices and present that as a new middle-range finding.
But they've just mistaken the common sense of the field, the folk theory, with a thin layer of abstraction on top as rigorous analytical theory.
Exactly. And they've remained trapped beneath that iron ceiling, just reproducing the ideological assumptions of society instead of subjecting them to structural analysis.
So reflexive science requires you to acknowledge your theoretical leanings from the outset, not just because it guides your questions, but because it's the only way to correctly interpret what you find.
Right. Theory frames what you sense and what you assemble as data. A rigorous, reflexive scientist knows that their analytical theory helps them challenge that folk theory.
How so?
Well, if a subject attributes their poverty to bad personal budgeting, the analytical theory, which might be about historical racism and housing, or post-industrial economic restructuring, enables the researcher to ask the deeper questions. Why are the only jobs available low wage? Why are the rents so high?
It allows you to see the structure behind the personal story.
Yes. That self-conscious acknowledgement of your theoretical lens is vital for moving beyond mere description to genuine explanation.
That distinction is so critical.
Yeah.
Okay, now let's pivot from this internal crisis of reflexivity to the external consequence that affects all of us. How this theoretical performance translates into the public sphere through the language of jargon.
Jargon.
Jargon is technical vocabulary, but when it's used performatively, it becomes a barrier.
It's more than just confusing. It can be cognitively destructive. And to understand its public cost, we need to talk about what's happening in the listener's head, specifically the mechanism of metacognition and something called processing fluency, or PF.
Processing fluency, that's basically the perceived ease or difficulty of handling new information, right? It's how fast and smoothly my brain registers a concept.
That's right. And it's a subjective emotional experience. When information processing is easy, when it's highly fluent, it triggers a hedonically positive response. Your mind interprets that ease as safety, familiarity, efficacy, and even liking.
So we have this kind of naive theory that if something is easy to understand, it must be valid and low risk.
We do. But if the language is difficult, technical, or filled with specialized vocabulary, if it's disfluent, your brain interprets that friction as a problem. It's a cognitive speed bump.
And that speed bump immediately triggers negative feelings.
Exactly. Uncertainty, scrutiny, and a perception of risk. And this is where the experimental data is so powerful. You might assume that if a scientist uses a technical term and then defines it, the problem is solved.
Yeah, I would assume that. If I read an academic paper that defines epistemological violence in a footnote, logically, I should be able to just continue reading with full comprehension.
Logically, yes. Emotionally and cognitively, no. The research shows that scientific information containing jargon significantly disrupts processing fluency, and, this is the critical part, this disruption persists even when the jargon terms are defined. That isolates the effect. It's about the inherent difficulty of processing the complex language, not simply a failure to comprehend the meaning. The sheer effort required to process those challenging technical words makes the cognitive experience difficult. And that difficult experience is then subconsciously attributed to the content itself, not the writing style.
So the mental energy I'm spending trying to juggle the definition of structural intersectionality is perceived by my subconscious as a kind of warning light about the safety or certainty of the scientific conclusion itself.
Precisely. That cognitive friction doesn't just stay in the realm of vocabulary. It becomes a fundamental resistance to the message. And that resistance is what researchers call motivated resistance to persuasion, or MRP.
What does that look like?
It involves a listener actively counter-arguing the message internally or experiencing psychological reactance, which is this oppositional response to feeling pressured or confused by the information source.
So the attempt to project intellectual authority through complex language actually achieves the exact opposite. It triggers skepticism and a defensive posture in the audience.
And this resistance has very serious real-world consequences for the adoption and acceptance of new technologies and findings. Researchers have documented this through a clear serial mediation effect. They found a sequence of causality.
Okay, walk us through that sequence step by step, because this is where that theoretical costume costs us tangible public support.
All right, step one. The use of jargon leads directly to low processing fluency. The language is just difficult to read and process even when it's defined.
Step one, got it.
Step two. Low processing fluency leads to high motivated resistance to persuasion. The reader or listener feels uncomfortable, so they begin to actively counter-argue the science.
Okay.
Step three. That high MRP then leads directly to increased risk perceptions and rigid support for technology adoption.
Wait, let me make sure I'm following the full implication here. Are we saying that if a scientist describes a new technology like a surgical robot or gene editing using dense jargon-laden language, the public will view that technology as inherently more dangerous than if the scientist had described the exact same technology using simple, high-fluency language?
That is exactly what the data suggests. The complexity of the phrasing indirectly influences perceptions of risk and willingness to support technologies like self-driving cars and 3D bioprinting.
So the theoretical costume, which is meant to impress peers and signal rigor, ends up backfiring completely. It effectively increases the public's emotional perception of risk and reduces their willingness to support new science.
By significant measurable margins.
That's a profound failure. The goal of science is to clarify the world, but here the language of the scientist is actually muddying the waters and contributing to public skepticism. That's the real payment of the reality tax.
It's the ultimate reality tax. By adding layers of abstraction, the scientist makes their own work less fluent, less trusted, and ultimately less useful to the society that funded it in the first place.
The reality tax is paid every time that researchers' theoretical script is prioritized over genuine, messy field observation. And we saw this so clearly in our introductory anecdote. Let's go back to that researcher Elias, studying the REDD plus climate policy in the rainforest.
Right. So Elias wasn't there to observe the trees. He was there to observe governmentality. That's a specific lens derived from Foucault that basically assumes the state is extending its power through subtle disciplinary means.
So his theoretical frame dictated his questions. He wasn't asking, how are your lives better? He was asking these leading questions designed to uncover state surveillance or subtle forms of coercion, right?
Exactly. He was looking for evidence that the policy was subtly disciplining the rural subject, forcing them to conform to neoliberal environmental demands, whether they realized it or not.
But the reality he ran into was, well, it was a lot more grounded and rational than that.
Which is precisely why he dismissed it. He went to a village elder to discuss the policy's impact on a protected grove. And instead of giving him the desired narrative of resistance or hidden coercion, the elder provided a simple, pragmatic, economic explanation. It was all about agency and material improvement.
Right. The elder said, we stopped cutting the grove near the river because the grant money bought us a generator. Now we can freeze fish.
That is the sound of reality crashing headfirst into theory. The elder's motivation was practical, immediate, and entirely rational. The ability to store and sell fish transformed their economic livelihood, which made logging less appealing.
But for Elias, the Foucault-inspired theorist, this agency, the generator, the fish, the economic choice, it was all irrelevant. It didn't fit the predetermined plot. So how did the theoretical costume compel him to write that reality out of his analysis?
He filtered it. He minimized the generator and the fish, treating the community's practical decision as just a secondary detail. Instead, he interpreted the entire REDD Plus system, which was basically a local economic development project tied to climate goals, as a subtle disciplining of the rural subject. He focused entirely on the structural arrangement of power, not the choices the community made within that structure.
The theory dictated what counted as observation.
It did.
The chaotic reality of human life was forced to recite lines from a pre-written script simply because the researcher was performing for his peers, not trying to understand the village.
Right.
And this brings us to the exclusionary ritual of academic language, which shows that external costs so vividly.
This is a powerful example. It involves urban sociologists presenting their work on the opioid crisis to a town hall. And this town hall is filled with anxious residents, parents, siblings, neighbors who were experiencing this raw, immediate trauma and were desperate for solutions.
So the setting demanded clarity. It demanded empathy.
It did. Yet instead of using accessible language about grief or unemployment or community support, the lead researcher prioritized these high-level performative terms.
Phrases like structural intersectionality and epistemological violence.
Exactly. Now, we just discussed how complex language disrupts processing fluency, but in this real-world context, that disruption isn't just a cognitive speed bump, it's an emotional barrier. When a mother who has lost a child hears about epistemological violence, she doesn't feel informed or validated. She feels excluded. She feels patronized.
That's a fundamental failure of empathy. The community felt utterly rejected by the very people who were supposed to be studying them and helping them.
And that's the core of the exclusionary ritual. The language chosen wasn't designed to clarify or communicate with the audience in the room. It was designed to signal expertise and command respect from the researcher's distant peers.
There was an observation from another academic there.
Yeah, the painful observation was, I think they're just talking to each other. The goal was ritualized knowledge production, a performance aimed at the institution. And it created this profound, painful detachment from the people who were supposed to benefit from the knowledge.
It's complete self-sabotage. The findings, no matter how valuable they might be, are confined to the academic seminar room. They're rendered inert by the complexity of their phrasing. The sophistication of the language becomes a substitute for the act of genuine, shared insight.
And this institutional pressure to prioritize theoretical performance over grounded discovery leads to the final and I think most damaging reality tax, the stifling of unique, uncomfortable truths.
Tell us the story of Sarah and the London gig economy ethnography. This is where institutional pressure essentially forced a researcher to lie about her own findings.
So Sarah went into the field with a theoretical costume, basically ready-made by her department's dominant framework, which was heavily influenced by Marxist sociology. And that theory dictated that all platform work, all gig work, must be inherently exploitative. It's a pure extraction of surplus value. Her research was expected to confirm this narrative.
That was the expectation. That was the protective belt she was supposed to go out and test and presumably confirm.
Yes. But her actual grounded fieldwork revealed a much messier, more complex reality. She found this strategic subgroup, mainly recent immigrants, who were using the flexibility of the platform to bypass traditional hiring processes.
Oh, so.
Well, they knew that traditional employers discriminated against them based on their names or their accent, but the platform offered a way to secure work immediately. And surprisingly, they often felt more empowered and autonomous than they did working for traditional, rigid employers.
That's a unique counterintuitive truth. It doesn't invalidate the whole exploitation narrative, but it adds immense nuance. It suggests that agency and complexity exist even within these exploitative structures.
It's exactly the kind of complex insight that moves a debate forward. But because it complicated the dominant framework, the theoretical hardcore of her department, her advisor warned her that these findings lack theoretical robustness.
In other words, they didn't align with the predefined exploitation narrative.
Right. And she faced a clear professional threat. Failure to publish, failure to secure a job. So what was the concession?
What did she do?
Sarah made the pragmatic, if painful, concession. She rewrote her findings. She buried the unique, counterintuitive truth about strategic agency and empowerment. And instead, she amplified the victimhood narrative, making sure her work achieved the necessary theoretical robustness that was required for publication and peer praise.
Wow. And that shows how the ritual perpetuates itself. The structure of institutional reward, the pressure to publish high-impact findings that conform to powerful theoretical schools, ensures repetition over genuine discovery.
Absolutely. If the researcher is punished for finding the fish in the generator and rewarded for finding the disciplining subject, they will eventually stop looking for the generator.
The problem of theoretical performance, jargon use, and the stifling of counterintuitive findings connects directly to a measurable, almost existential crisis in research rigor, particularly across the social and psychological sciences.
We're referring to the well-documented crisis of replication.
The replication crisis, where published findings just can't be reproduced by independent researchers. I think for a lot of listeners, this sounds like a technical academic problem, but the scale of the failure fundamentally undermines the public's perception of scientific reliability. Just how extensive is this crisis?
It's stark. In 2015, there was a landmark, large-scale collaborative project that attempted to replicate 100 high-profile psychological studies. And the results were, well, they were alarming. Researchers were only able to successfully replicate 35% of those original findings.
Only 35%.
65 out of 100 peer-reviewed findings did not hold up when the procedures were repeated. And when science can only confirm about a third of its own claims, public confidence inevitably erodes.
Why are these failures happening at such a high rate? Is it simply incompetence, or is it linked back to the performance pressure we've been talking about?
It is intrinsically linked to the incentive structure. The pressure to publish novel, positive, and theory-affirming results, the results that get headlines and peer praise, incentivizes researchers toward what are called questionable research practices, or QRPs.
And these are practices that manipulate the research process to get a good result.
Yes, to achieve a statistically significant outcome.
Can you define the most common of these questionable practices for us?
The most notorious example is selective reporting, which is often called p-hacking. This is when a researcher collects a large data set and runs multiple different statistical analyses, maybe 10, 15, even 20 different models, but only publishes the favorable ones. So for instance, you might hypothesize that X causes Y. You run 15 different tests, and only one of those tests shows a statistically significant relationship. You then publish only that one favorable result, making it appear that your hypothesis and the underlying theory were strongly supported, while burying the 14 null results.
You're essentially cherry-picking the data analysis that confirms your theoretical costume, and that increases the rate of false positives in the literature, which then inevitably leads to replication failures down the line and destroys public confidence in the objectivity of the entire field.
It's a systemic issue. It's born of the pressure to prioritize positive, flashy results over methodological integrity. And so the solution has to be structural. It has to be a radical shift toward transparency and rigor designed to incentivize reliable practice over an exciting outcome.
What are the key reform efforts that are actively trying to change this system?
The foundational shift is the push for greater transparency in data and methods, just making the raw materials of research publicly accessible so they can be scrutinized. But the most revolutionary change is the adoption of registered reports. This is a radical pre-commitment strategy that completely reverses the publication incentive structure.
Explain how a registered report works. Because it sounds like a complete reversal of the traditional scientific process where you submit your findings after the fact.
It is. In a traditional process, you collect your data, you find a cool result, then you write the paper and submit it. In a registered report, the researcher pre-specifies their statistical analyses, their hypotheses, and their detailed methodology before they collect a single data point.
Okay.
And they submit this detailed plan, this stage 1 document, to a journal for peer review.
So the journal is judging the research question and the proposed method, not the results.
Precisely. If the plan is deemed rigorous and the research question is important, the journal grants what's called an in-principle acceptance. And this means the journal commits to publishing the article regardless of the results, whether the findings are positive, null, or even contrary to the hypothesis.
The focus shifts entirely from finding a specific result to following a rigorous, transparent method. That is a profound change. It completely removes the incentive for selective reporting or for burying inconvenient data like Sarah's complex findings in the gig economy study, because the researcher knows the article will be published either way.
It prioritizes the soundness of the method over the excitement of the outcome.
And this structural change, you said, has a paradoxical benefit when it comes to public trust.
It does. While awareness of replication failures might cause a momentary dip in trust in past results, public awareness of science actively engaging in self-criticism and implementing rigorous reform initiatives like registered reports often maintains or even increases trust in the future findings of the field.
Transparency breeds confidence. It shows that science is a self-correcting enterprise.
It is.
This brings us back, full circle, to the philosophical grounding of this entire debate. The necessary tension between theory and empirical data. The ultimate goal is not a return to some impossible atheoretical purity, but rather to achieve reflexive rigor.
Right. And contemporary philosophy of science overwhelmingly accepts that observation is theory-laden. The idea of a pure observation untouched by any assumption is largely a fiction. Empirical data has to be processed using theoretical assumptions to transform it from raw records, like a blip on a sensor, into useful empirical results that actually bear on a theory.
So if I'm a cosmologist, my raw record might be a noisy spectrogram from a distant galaxy. But to convert that raw record into a useful empirical result, like a galactic rotation curve, I have to apply complex corrections and scaling. And all of that requires theoretical judgment. The data is never naked.
Exactly. The question isn't whether theory is involved in the conversion, the correction, the scaling, or the statistical analysis. The crucial test for reflexive science is whether the researcher's theoretical assumptions are being used to guarantee that the evidence will turn out to be confirmatory.
So, if the researcher is willing to put their protective belt on the line, if they're willing to critically appraise and reconstruct their theory based on a refutation, then the theoretical lens is acting as a necessary tool for genuine learning about the world.
A rigorous ethnographer has to lay bare their worldview and their theoretical hardcore from the outset. That transparency structures what is observed, but the commitment must always be to allow overwhelming empirical investigation to modify those testable auxiliary hypotheses. The aim is to reconstruct the abstraction based on the mess of empirics, rather than letting the abstraction dictate the mess.
So ensuring that the theoretical costume is worn only as a tool for seeing more clearly, never as a means of performance.
That's the goal.
We've taken a deep dive into the intellectual battlefield within the social sciences, detailing the cost of the iron ceiling and the heavy price of the jargon tax. The path forward seems to demand an accountability rooted in radical transparency and a commitment to treating theory as a framework for reconstruction, not merely a script for institutional ritual.
Knowledge is most valuable when it's understood and applied. The world is complex enough without scholars adding layers of performative abstraction. The commitment to reflexive science is the only way to ensure we see the forest for the trees.